So good morning. Welcome to FDA's webinar for industry on FDA's guidance to provide flexibility to manufacturers to increase infant formula supplies. I'm Janisha Robbs with FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition Communications and Public Engagement staff. Today we will open with remarks from Dr. Susan Mayne, Director of FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Then you will hear from Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, and then Mr. John Verbeten, Deputy Director for Import Operations Enforcement, Office of Regulatory Affairs. After the presentations, we will open the webinar for questions from the audience. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the FDA's meeting webpage at a later date. Before we get started, I would like to remind participants that your lines will be in listen-only or mute mode during the presentation. If you run into any technical issues, feel free to send us a note in the chat box and we will try to help. With that, I will now turn the call over to Dr. Susan Mayne, Director of FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition.
Great. Thank you, Janisha. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us to discuss the steps we are taking to increase the supply of infant formula in the U.S. We know that you share our concern for parents and caregivers who are unable to access needed or desired infant formula and critical medical foods. You know as well as I do that many of these products serve as the only source of nutrition for many infants. So this situation is of utmost importance to us. Our new guidance streamlines the ability for companies, including those that do not normally sell infant formula in this country, to make products available to the U.S. market, while also ensuring that nutrition and safety standards are being met. It also provides flexibilities to those who do distribute infant formula products in the U.S. and may be able to increase available product volume even further than they have already. With these additional flexibilities in place, we anticipate that additional products can quickly hit U.S. stores. These flexibilities are important, but we know how essential infant formula manufacturers are to making this happen. I strongly encourage all of you to work with us to quickly make progress. We are already having discussions with some manufacturers regarding additional imports and increased production at domestic facilities. And we greatly appreciate that manufacturers have worked for weeks to step up production of formulas already sold in the U.S. as much as they can. In addition to issuing this guidance, we are also taking a look at the supply of infant formulas developed by manufacturers across the country and around the world to determine if a reallocation of their distribution can be made to help get the right product to the right place at the right time. The FDA expects that the measures and steps it is taking with infant formula manufacturers and others will mean more and more supply is on the way or on store shelves moving forward. In fact, our data tell us that in-stock rates in retail stores are already improving. With increased production by other manufacturers, the many actions we've been taking, and the potential for Abbott Nutrition's Sturgis, Michigan facility to resume production in the near term, the FDA expects supply to continue to improve over the next couple of months. We all have important work to do, so I will turn it over to Dr. Pat Hansen, who will go into more detail about the guidance.
Thank you, Dr. Mayne, and good morning, everyone. The guidance we announced on Monday lays out the agency's intention to exercise flexibility on a case-by-case basis for certain requirements that apply to infant formula. The guidance is related to both the importation of infant formula produced in other countries and infant formula that is produced in the United States. It will remain in effect until November 14th of this year, and we will evaluate, that is, monitor the situation and evaluate whether any extension is necessary. The guidance explains to infant formula manufacturers what information the FDA needs to evaluate whether the product is safe and nutritionally adequate for this enforcement discretion guidance purpose. We have established a mailbox for submissions. The address is shown on the screen. I will note that FDA will handle The information consistent with our obligations under the applicable regulations, that is, protection of trade secrets and confidential commercial information that's not available for public disclosure. We would ask that use of this box be limited to requests for enforcement discretion and questions regarding our enforcement discretion policy. Later, we'll provide additional resources for questions on other topics that may be related to infant formula, but not specifically to the policy itself or a request for enforcement discretion under the policy. I will note that the agency is prioritizing enforcement discretion requests for products for which safety and nutritional adequacy can be demonstrated. It is based on the information provided addressing those areas and for which manufacturers have the largest volume of product and or can get product onto U.S. shelves the quickest. I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the guidance, and in order to facilitate subsequent requests, I would like to focus on the type of information to provide to the FDA if you would like us to consider whether to exercise enforcement discretion with regard to your particular products. I will talk about the information we need for each infant formula product and for each manufacturing facility. So for each infant formula product, we need from you the infant formula's specific name and other product identification information. As much information as you can provide will be helpful. The information on the number and size of retail containers also will be helpful. Other identifying information should include batch and lot numbers, product identification codes such as universal product codes or UPCs, or stock keeping unit SKU numbers. If the product has been previously notified to FDA through our normal process for new infant formula submissions, you should provide that product identification number or IFN. Also helpful, the names of the countries where the product is currently marketed and how long the product has been in that market. The quantity of the product intended for introduction into U.S. commerce is also needed. At a minimum, the quantity should be expressed by weight, ideally poundage, but metric units are acceptable. Additional information regarding the form in which it will be introduced, such as number of cases, number of cans or bottles, and size of those cans or bottles is also helpful. We also need to know whether the quantity intended for introduction into interstate commerce is in the infant formula manufacturer's current inventory. If so, please provide the product's use-by date. If the product is not in your current inventory, we would ask that you provide the date on which you would plan to introduce the product into interstate commerce or import into the United States. It also will be helpful to indicate whether a one-time shipment or multiple shipments are intended. We would also ask that you provide the names and locations of the manufacturing facilities where the specified batches and lots, that is, those intended for import or introduction into interstate commerce, are made. If available, we would also like your distribution plans down to the retail level, if at all possible. Critical piece of information is the infant formula's full quantitative formulation. I cannot stress this enough. That will be a list of all ingredients and the amount of each ingredient in units per absolute amount or absolute quantity. For example, milligrams per 1,000 grams of infant formula or grams per liter of infant formula. Please do not provide percentages. We need these absolute amounts this year. Very important as well will be a copy for each product, copy of the product's label, and a description of the product's packaging. Moving on, for the most For batches and lots, if they're in inventory intended for introduction into commerce, we would like to have a summary of the test results on those batches or lots conducted at the final product stage at the level of each nutrient required by U.S. regulations. I'm not going to provide full citations here in the interest of moving along, but they can be found. We have resources on our website that will point to the relevant regulations. They are in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations in Parts 106 or Parts 107. That diversion for nutrients included that are not required by our U.S. regulations. We recognize some may have those in addition to the required ones. We would like a summary of the test results presented in units for 100 kilocalories. So to summarize, if the test results for the batches or lots intended for introduction are available, submit them. If these are future production, we need for the most recent batch or lot of each of those products produced at the facility in question, a summary of the test results. Moving on, we have two categories of infant formula basically outlined in our regulations. For specialized formulas, those that are not intended for healthy term infants and that may not meet all of the basic nutrient requirements, we will need an explanation for why the deviation from those nutrient requirements is necessary to provide an infant formula that is appropriate for the dietary management of the specific disease, disorder, or medical condition for which it is intended. And last for the per-product information, and this for powdered infant formula. Similar to the test in results for nutrient levels, we're going to want, if the product is in inventory, the test results for each of the batches or lots involved in the request for discussion, a summary of the test results for Chronobacter sakazaki, excuse the font weirdness on the slide, and Salmonella that were conducted at the final product stage. For the Chronobacter species, we recommend testing 30 samples, with each sample being 10 grams. For Salmonella species, we recommend testing 60 samples, with each sample being 25 grams. We also ask for a description of the test method used, such as FDA's Bacteriological Analytical Manual, or BAM. There are other methods available. We leave a citation and a copy. For example, a certificate of analysis with information listed in federal or other applicable regulations from a qualified laboratory may be one way to convey these results. We intend to exercise some flexibility around this, recognizing that products manufactured for other countries or jurisdictions may have been produced with the view of meeting other standards in mind. So again, just to sum, if the product is in inventory, we want these test results produced for each batch or lot involved in the request for information discretion. If it is future production, we want you to send to us a copy of the test results, again, for each product, the most recent batch or lot produced at the applicable facility. And again, details are shown on the slide here. Move on, Janisha. Now for each manufacturing facility that's involved in the request for enforcement discretion, we are requesting a certification that the manufacturer has established current good manufacturing practices, including control procedures and in-process controls and testing required by current good manufacturing practice. We also ask that you provide a schematic diagram or a process flow diagram with processing times and temperatures. And in addition to the diagram, that you submit a written narrative that includes, but is not limited to, a summary of the process flow, heating and processing conditions, as I've mentioned, and importantly, critical control points within the overall process. To move on, as applicable, the food facility registration number. If the manufacturing facility does not have such a number and has not received an FDA inspection, we ask that you provide to us the date of the last inspection by the relevant government authority, or in cases where this is applicable, a third-party audit conducted by a qualified auditor on behalf of the government authority. We're also looking for a summary of the findings of that inspection and any actions taken by the manufacturer in response. In this latter instance, the standards and regulations, that is, if you do not have an FDA inspection, we also request that you provide us with information as to the standards and regulations against which the inspection was conducted. Clearly identify those relevant standards. I want to make clear that as we review submissions, we may not be able to grant all requests for enforcement discretion. For example, an infant formula whose level for a specific nutrient is below the minimum that we require or does not contain the specific nutrient we require might not be an appropriate candidate for enforcement discretion, especially if the low level or absence of that nutrient could present a safety issue for infants. In contrast, an infant formula that has a label listing ingredients in a different order or in a slightly different format than that required by U.S. regulations may be a product that would be appropriate for enforcement discretion. As an example, clear identification of any allergens, the major food allergens under U.S. requirements, must be declared on the product label. Also, adequate instructions for safe product preparation and use, also required by U.S. law and regulations. These are connected to safety, and they're going to receive special attention in our review of request for enforcement discretion. Hope this overview has been helpful, and I will be happy to answer questions during the Q&A session. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Mr. John Verbeten, with FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, to talk about import operations for infant formula. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the importation process. Now, the guidance Dr. Hansen discussed paves the way for companies who don't normally distribute their infant formula products in the U.S. To do so efficiently and safely. We're hopeful this call to the global market will be answered and that international businesses will rise to the occasion to assist in bolstering the supply of products that serve as the sole source of nutrition for many infants. Okay, so we're looking at something that may provide flexibilities to those who manufacture infant formula products domestically in the U.S. for export and may be able to increase further domestically produced product for the domestic market. First off, for the import operations part of it, only products reviewed by FDA and to which FDA does not object, or what we're going to call no objection products, through the process you just heard about, will be allowed distribution in the U.S. And I'll provide a brief overview of that importation process. Once that determination is made, our colleagues at CFSAN will notify us in the import operations of the no objection companies and their products. And using that information, we'll update our entry systems to make sure that we know when those are coming in. At the time of importation, the importer, who in vast majority of cases is going to be the U.S. customer or the U.S. distributor, will submit entry information to U.S. Customs and Border Protection in accordance to the normal import procedures. And then also per those normal import procedures, CBP will notify FDA and our import operations of those entries. And this is the same as we do for all imports of FDA regulated products. Like I said, we will update our electronic import system, and we will also instruct our import staff about the no objection products and firms to help facilitate that entry. And then once those no objection products are released, they can move into those established supply channels. And we'll provide in the presentation a link to fda.gov where you can find out more about the FDA import procedures. And that's really what I have right now for the import processes. And I'm going to turn this back over to the moderator, Janisa.
Great, thank you. So at this time, we will begin the question and answer portion of the webinar. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. So we ask that you use the chat box located in the middle of your screen. Just provide your name and affiliation if possible when asking your question. Also, please ensure that your question pertains to the guidance and limit yourself to one and maybe a follow-up question so we can get to as many questions as possible. Several questions were submitted during the webinar registration process, so I'll start with those while we continue to accept questions in the chat. Our first question came from B. Waltrip, and this one is for Pat. Does the enforcement discretion provide long-term access to the U.S. market?
Thank you, Janisha. No, it does not. This is a temporary enforcement discretion. Briefly, for formulas that normally would need to submit a new infant formula submission to us in order to enter the U.S. market and to submit that 90 days ahead of time, we are exercising limited enforcement discretion with respect to aspects of that process. This does not provide long-term entry, however, to the U.S. market. That is, the enforcement discretion does not alter the status of such a formula, the new infant formula status. So no, this does not provide long-term access. The enforcement discretion policy will expire on November the 14th. We will, as I said earlier, continue to monitor the situation and evaluate whether an extension is necessary.
Great. Thank you, Pat. The next question we received from D. Cohen. Are there different regulations for different sorts of baby formulas, such as infant formula, growing up formula, special formula, etc.? Or is it a uniform regulation for all?
Thank you for that question. Our regulations recognize two categories of infant formula. There are the so-called non-exempt. These are the formulas for healthy term infants. And then we have another category called the exempt. And these are formulas that are intended for preterm, low birth weight infants or those with particular diseases or medical conditions. We do not recognize or have regulations governing the many categories that we see appearing in some other international standards. Our infant formulas, again, are for ages 0 up to 12 months. We don't have subcategories for 0 to 6 months or 6 to 12. We have one age period up to 1 year for infant formulas.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so we'll move to another question that we received through the registration. Elisa Naclario, and I think this question is for John. What is the criteria for importing infant formula? Accessible countries for import, ingredient lists and requirements, required import documentation.
Thank you for that question. First off, I'll start with reminding folks that only those products that have been reviewed by FDA, reviewed by the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and to which FDA does not object, will be allowed distribution in the U.S. The import process for the infant formula products is going to be twofold. First, prior to arrival in the U.S., the importer must provide to FDA the information that is required by the prior notice rule. Among other data elements, the foreign manufacturer must be identified, and that includes food facility registration with FDA. And so manufacturers who have not previously exported to the U.S., and we can provide this link, you can register your firm with FDA as a food facility online, and we'll provide that link. That's generally handled, as is the majority of the importation process, by the U.S. customer or distributor or their entry filer, or what we call a broker. So we have the prior notice piece, and then we also need to have, at the time of entry, the importer file an entry with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And again, because infant formula is regulated by FDA, CBP will forward that entry information to FDA for review. The information required for the entry, again, is generally submitted by the importer or by an entry filer or broker who works for the importer. All entries of FDA-regulated product require information about the product manufacturer, shipper, importer, consignee, what the product is, the name, description, and FDA product code, etc. There are no additional specific entry declarations required at the time of entry for infant formula. So, I think I saw some questions about batch certification or submission of other information at the time of entry. These shipments, we would expect, have already gone through the process with CFSAN, so that's not going to be necessary at the time of entry. Now, the entry filer who's going to be handling this work for the U.S. importer or distributor, they're expected, and they are knowledgeable about and competent in the filing of entry information and those requirements for all the commodities for which they facilitate entry. So they should be able to help on an entry-by-entry basis if there's specific questions there.
Great. Thanks, John. Our next question comes from R. Caravaggio, and sorry if I mispronounced your name. How much advance notice will manufacturers receive before guidance is allowed to expire? And this question's for Pat.
Thank you. We don't have a set time frame for that. As I mentioned, the guidance itself provides an expiration date for the policy of November 14th of this year. And as I mentioned, we're going to continue to monitor the infant formula supply situation and consider whether we need an extension. I can say that we will provide advance notice if we are likely to extend. We recognize that folks need to make plans, plenty of logistics involved, and so if we are considering an extension, we intend to provide advance notice.
Great.
And we will
Thank you.
And we will also, of course, provide the information publicly about any such extension should we decide to form one in place.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from D. Chen, and the question reads, our current formula labeling is compliant to Australia and New Zealand requirements. Will we need to over-label the product? That's the first part, and it has two more questions, but would you like me to read the rest of the questions, or would you like to answer that one first?
Let's take them one at a time, Janisha, because they cover a bit of ground. Okay, so to the first part of this question about the need to over-label the product, we're going to review each request on a case-by-case basis. We've requested abundant label information and a copy of the product label so we can fully evaluate the label information vis-a-vis requirements that we have, which cover quite a few areas as far as labeling. We're going to assess the extent of any deviations from our requirements and really focus on those that are not likely to present a safety or nutritional adequacy issue, and considering whether to grant enforcement discretion from any particular labeling requirement. As mentioned before, some deviations might be more major, and we might want to look very carefully. For example, if instructions for safe preparation and use are missing or don't comply with important aspects of our requirements, we may not grant enforcement discretion in that case. And in that kind of a case, there might be a need for relabeling or overlabeling. We expect those instances hopefully to be limited. And again, it really will depend case by case, what the label looks like, and the extent of any deviations from our requirements, and whether those deviations might lead to a health issue.
Thanks. And then the second question that Dechen had was, what does significant quantity of inventory look like?
I can't give a quantitative answer to that question. We recognize that significant is going to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, kind of based on the volume of their business. I can say from our perspective, request to import a couple of cases, right? That might have a dozen cans apiece. It is not going to likely rise to the level of a significant quantity of inventory. But I cannot, I'm sorry, give you a quantitative answer there. We're looking for more than just a few cases in order to really make an impact on the infant formula supply situation currently obtaining.
Great. And then the last question, any red line relating to nutrients not meeting U.S. regulatory requirements?
My answer here is similar to that in the first part of this question. We don't have a hard and fast set of criteria here. We are going to look, again, case by case on the information that manufacturers submit to us. I'd stack up, for example, the label information on nutrient levels, the nutrient level testing. In some cases, we would be willing to entertain folks on, of course, we will go back and forth. If we have questions about nutrient levels, about labeling information, we will ask those. We will get back to you. And so there may be a little bit of that process, too, to really pin the picture down and assess whether any particular request will receive enforcement discussion. The nutrient levels will, of course, be part of that.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move to some questions about, or questions that are for John. We received a couple of questions from S. Smith. The first question being, will companies that qualify for relaxed enforcement be made public?
Sure, I can answer that. The FDA will list products reviewed by FDA and to which FDA does not object for distribution in the U.S. The location for that listing on FDA.gov will be made public later. It's not been determined yet.
Great, thank you. And then there was another question from the submitter. Does FDA expect any changes to the prior notice and PGA message sent information based on this guidance, specifically related to registration numbers and facilities?
No, all of those prior notice requirements will still apply, and the same information will be required with the entry submissions as well.
Thank you. Another question for you, John, from Chris Ferner. How quickly is infant formula coming into the U.S. market from abroad?
Well, I can say that, since around February of 2022, the FDA has been expediting import entries of infant formula imported from the foreign manufacturers, who had previously complied with the pre-market registration and submission requirements. So depending on, how long some of this other process takes, we'll do the same there, where we'll work to facilitate those entries when they show up.
Great, thank you. All right, so we've taken a look at some of the questions we received in the chat, and we do want to address two common questions that we're receiving. So I'm going to hand this over to Pat to talk a little bit about whether the label must be in English and if the milliliters versus ounces differences present an issue.
Thank you, Janisha. We believe that labeling in English is essential for our U.S. consumers. And so that is going to be an important element in our consideration. We recognize that there may be some additional ways to provide essential information to consumers, which is why we've asked also if the label is not in English, that a English language translation of the label, a full translation, be provided. We could envision circumstances where it might be possible, for example, with a product insert or an information sheet, again, to provide the information to consumers. But our clear preference, and we will give priority to products that are already labeled in English. And there was another aspect to this question, Janisha. Could you please refresh me on that?
Yes. So there were questions about the conversion, or milliliters versus ounces, and whether or not that presents an issue.
We recognize that this is going to be a common issue for many products and firms who are not currently exporting formula for the U.S. market. We are envisioning providing some resources for consumers to understand these issues in preparation and safe use. And I think we are willing to work with manufacturers and exercise some degree of flexibility around the units. Again, it's all dependent as well on what we do receive as far as the other elements that we outlined in the guidance. And again, our focus is on ensuring safety and nutritional adequacy. Labeling is a part of that. Units can be a piece of that.
Great, thank you. All right, we received a question from R. Blitzer, and it reads, we have products ready to ship. Who do we talk to?
Do not ship your products until you have submitted a request to us for enforcement discretion through the portal that's provided in the guidance document, and I believe we have it in at least one place in the slide set here. We will evaluate each request, again, on a case-by-case basis. If we require additional information or have questions, we will get back to you. When we reach a decision about whether to grant enforcement discretion or not, and under what conditions and from which requirements, we will respond to the requester by letter. That would be the no objection determination that my colleague John spoke about. So do not ship product that is not in compliance with current U.S. requirements unless you have received from us, unless you've submitted to us, first of all, a request through the portal paying careful attention, please, to the needed information that's outlined in the guidance. If you have questions about those elements, please also submit your questions through the request portal, and we will get back to you. Do not ship your product until you have received a response letter from us indicating the parameters of our enforcement discretion. John, is there anything you would like to add there?
No, I think you're exactly right. We'll be applying this discretion at the time of entry for those products that have been indicated with the no objection letter. Other shipments of infant formula that haven't met the criteria that's been put forth, we will continue to enforce the rules applicable to infant formula products. So without that, going through that process first, getting that no objection letter, unfortunately you're going to run into problems at the time of entry.
Thanks, John.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next question. We're realizing that we have about 2 minutes left of the call. But the next question is from F. Aquino. Is there a due date for manufacturers to submit required documentation to be able to export infant formula into America?
I'll take that one, Janisha. No, there is not a due date, but please note that enforcement discretion guidance, our policy outlined therein, currently will expire on November 14th of 2022. And I think we have gone over quite a bit about the process, and I believe most manufacturers are recognizing that requests will take a little bit of time to evaluate and a little bit of time for them to prepare. So please keep that time frame in mind. We don't have a date in advance of November the 14th where we'll stop taking requests. But if you submit it, on November the 14th or November the 13th, and we've not, issued notice of extension, you're not going to be in a very good place with getting a letter from us before the time of expiry of the policy.
Thanks, Pat. All right, so we have time for one more question, and it comes from M9. What does certification for current good manufacturing practice refer to in the guidance?
And I'll take that one, Janisha, as well.
Thanks.
Certification for current good manufacturing practice, and then as described further in the guidance, is referring to a statement or an attestation from the responsible official at the company at the facility that those requirements, that those policies and procedures as outlined in the guidance are in place. So again, an affirmative statement or attestation addressing the elements outlined in the guidance for that particular point of information.
Great, thank you, thank you. So we have about 30 seconds left, and I just really want to thank everyone for joining today's call. We did try to answer as many common questions as we could, and we have several resources that we will display at the end of the call. If you have general questions about infant formula, we do have a resource page where you can ask your questions. Also, send any information that was described in Part 3D of this guidance document in English to the email address on the slide. And then if you want more information about the actual guidance, see the link in the first bullet. So this concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available on FDA's meeting webpage shortly. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.